Hey guys, welcome back into my studio and welcome to part 2 of this Leopard eye tutorial. So now that we have the eye in place, this tutorial is going to focus more on the fur and all the different aspects on how I achieve the texture to emulate that fur. Now it probably doesn't come as much of a shock to anyone that's followed my social media accounts for any sort of time, but I love drawing animals, especially in scratchboard. I feel like this medium really lends itself well to rendering fur, so this ends up always being my favourite part of my drawings. So as you can sort of see initially, I've zoomed out a little bit on this section so that you can see the whole board and how I sort of work my way around the board. It's sped up quite a fair bit faster than part 1. So this is roughly about, I think, 20 times normal speed, which is quite fast. Parts of the video, however, will be slowed down to about double speed, really, just so you can see a little bit clearer what I'm doing and how I'm rendering that fur. But the whole video itself, the whole process took about, I think in total, about 6 to 7 hours. The eye itself, the iris, took about an hour. So the fur really took the most time in this. So in order to get that condensed down into about a 20-minute period, I've had to speed it up quite a lot. So most of the techniques that I'm doing in this sort of lend itself to any medium. So just because I'm doing it in scratchboard doesn't mean that you can't use the same techniques in pastel, in colour pencil, in paints even. The sort of techniques that I'm actually using, they are transferable to different mediums. You know, you're going to hear me say constantly probably, keep your darks dark enough and your lights light enough, and it's going to be that contrast that really takes your art to the next level. And allows you to create realistic drawings or paintings in whichever medium you choose. So you can see how I'm actually laying this fur in. I'm using the tattoo needles initially to get that very, very fine base layer, just to establish the direction in which the fur is going, and just to give a little bit of underneath texture. So these first layers are almost the fur that you'd see in the dark, deep recesses of this leopard. And then as we lay this first layer down, I'm then going to come back over with a little bit more pressure, just to create sort of those mid-tones, especially with, you'll see my slice tool that I'm going to use to get most of them in. And then finally I'm going to come back in on top of all that with my brightest highlights. But I'm constantly reassessing where I'm going to put those highlights and how bright I'm going with the fur. But like I said in my other video, it's very much, you don't want to go in too bright, too fast with this. The best way to do it is to keep those strokes light, to take your time, to not rush really. Because it is going to take a bit of time. In order to get something that looks realistic, it is going to take more time. You're not going to be able to get this done really in an hour. So when I started the eye, I said you had to observe the eye and sort of work out what technique you were going to use to get the texture of the eye and make it as realistic as possible. Now the same sort of technique applies to when you're trying to render fur. So I spent a little bit of time looking at my reference photo, trying to work out, you know, what type of fur did this animal have? Is it a short wavy fur? Is it long and curly? Does it come across like brindled fur? And what you're going to try and do is match your fur strokes to that type of fur. So you've got to pay, like I say again, special attention to the way that fur's laid, which direction it's going in, the length of fur stroke that you're going to put down to create that. Now, rarely is any fur going to be extremely straight, and there's always going to be a slight curve in the hair. So that's what I'm going to try and emulate with this one. So never, even though it may look like I am with the part of the picture that I'm on now, these fur strokes aren't actually straight. They've got a very slight curvature to them, and that's just going to help give your work a little bit more of a realistic appearance. And again, don't be afraid to rotate your board. So as you can see, I do rotate my board quite a lot. Just allows me to get a little bit of a a better angle really to put those first strokes in. Now, it's kind of hard to tell at the moment. You might be able to see a little bit more when I slow the video down, but in regards to actually the strokes that I'm performing, I'm always pulling my tool towards me. I know you can't, like I say, you can't really tell when the video is sped up this much, but the reason for that is when I lift my tool at the end of the stroke, it creates this natural taper like you'd normally get with fur. So fur's normally a little bit thicker at the root where the base is, and then it tapers off to a more point, and that's what I'm trying to emulate. So I'm pulling my first stroke towards me to give that taper, and I find that just helps give that slightly more realistic look as well. Slowed the video down a little bit here for you. So like I said, this is more, I think it's about double speed from what I remember. Now this, I feel this speed you can sort of see a little bit more how I'm creating the strokes. So again, I'm using that tattoo needle with a single blade just to stop me going too light too early with this fur, because that's the last thing I want. Lines that you put down on scratch board are incredibly difficult to hide if you go wrong. So if you go in and put a line in that's either going in the wrong direction or it's a little bit too bright, it's going to be very hard to mask that. So these tattoo needles are incredibly good at, they flex quite a lot, so it stops you going, like I say, too bright too soon. And you can tell a little bit more about how I'm laying this fur down. So I'm working at the fur that I think is going to be the deepest or the furthest back, and then I'm overlaying it with fur that's a little bit closer to the surface, making sure that I go around these dark spots, because they're very important. They're gonna let you know that you are actually drawing a leopard. If I was to fill in all those, it could be any animal really. So I hope you can see the sort of texture, the techniques that I'm using to get this texture in on the fur. It's, to be honest, it's not that difficult. I'm not doing anything particularly special. I'm just pulling lines in the direction of the fur, slightly curving my strokes as I do so. And then once all this side's filled in with that lighter, more faded strokes, I'm going to go over the top, come back in with my second layer, and then again with my final layer, adding my final highlights. So you may see every now and again, especially when I slow the video down for you, that I'm ever so slightly just rubbing my finger over the surface of the board. Now the reason I do this is when you scratch the top layer of India ink off the board, it leaves a very fine dust on the board. Now if I feel like I want an area to be darker than what I've actually created it, so if I've gone a little bit too light with my strokes and there's still a little bit of dust on the board, if I just rub that dust back into where I've lifted it off in the past and where I've done these first strokes, it actually fades the lines slightly, so it allows me to almost just slightly darken up some of the fur that I may have gone a little bit too light with, or a little bit too heavy handed in my opinion with my strokes. So this is where now you can see I'm coming back in with these slightly harder, slightly brighter strokes, and this is going to create almost that, like I say, that mid-tone of colour, just to give you a little bit more dynamic to the piece really. So the brightest areas are going to be that layer of fur just underneath the eye and just above the eye, so I'm making sure not to go as bright as those two, because if I go as bright as that, the only real way that I have to go then about my drawing is to make those two areas even brighter, and then that might come across a little bit stark. It may not be accurate to what I'm drawing, so I'm being very, very careful not to go too bright with these strokes. And as you can see, I'm slightly overlapping my strokes into those darker spotted areas. So those black areas, they're not just hollow, there is black fur there. So what I'm trying to do is overlay that, and you'll see that come in back in a little bit later, and add fur strokes into those black areas, because like I say, how the light's coming in, it does catch those black areas of fur as well as the light areas. And don't be afraid if you've accidentally got one of the spots in slightly the wrong area, or the shape of the spot doesn't quite match the reference photo. It doesn't really matter. This leopard could be any leopard really. The spots aren't going to be in the exact same place on every animal. How the animal's facing, if the photographer took a photo, a couple of minutes later when the sun had gone in, or the leopard had changed position, all the lighting and the spots that you're going to see, they're all going to be in a very slightly different position anyway. So it's not a great deal. All we're trying to get is a general impression of that fur going in the right direction. The spots, like I say, they don't have to be exactly the same as the reference photo. So one of the issues you have when working with graphite transfer paper is if you end up going quite light with the lines, then throughout your piece you may find that you've ended up inadvertently smudging off some of those lines and making them no longer visible, which is exactly what happened when working on the left hand side of this leopard's face. I've actually ended up smudging off quite a few of the lines, so in this respect I had to pay a lot of attention, focus quite heavily on that reference photo and make sure that I was going in the right direction with the fur. I was getting the spots in roughly the right place. Like I say, it doesn't matter completely if they're a little bit out. But one of the ways you can avoid doing this is either putting gloves on like I've got, or just trying to be conscious about not resting your hand on the board, because that constant back and forth motion when you're creating your strokes is going to potentially remove some of that graphite lines. So around this area, you can see that the fur has actually changed slightly. So it's a little bit longer where it was coming off the bottom of the eye and going onto the cheek, and it was also a little bit longer just above where the eye is located. So now I'm having to pay particular attention to the length of fur of my stroke. So it's a much shorter stroke really that I'm doing in this area. And as well as being shorter, the fur is also starting to become a little bit brighter as well. So lighter fur and brighter fur actually takes a lot more time to render than what darker fur does, which might not come as much of a surprise to you, but it involves putting a lot more layers down, a lot more pressure in those layers, and almost a little bit more fine tuning to get the different tonal values in the lights that you've got. it's a lot easier for me anyway, just to go to have really dark fur, because all it takes is a little bit of lighter pressure. However, like I say, with lighter fur, it takes a lot of building up, and there's not as much room for error when creating lighter fur. So if you're creating darker fur and you go a little bit too light, like I say, you can go back in with some India ink, some touch-up repair ink, and that can just help redarken some of those areas, and really you're not going to notice too much difference. However, with lighter fur, if you go either a little bit too light, you can't really go too dark because you just lighten it back up, but if you go too light, it's very hard to get that area to go dark again, especially with the repair ink that you've got. So if you're to go back in with that repair ink, there's a little bit of a chance that it can turn a little bit brown. You have to do a little bit more mixing with the inks that you've got to get a more black tone ink. It doesn't come straight out of the bottle, unfortunately, as black. It's more of a sepia, so it does have a slight hint of brown to it, and I've not really had too much success with darkening very, very light areas, so just be a little bit more careful when you are creating that lighter area. You can always go back in and make things lighter, but like I say, especially with light areas, it's very hard to go back in and make those areas darker. So as you can see, especially now that I'm getting to the recess of the corner of this leopard's eye, the fur is getting incredibly short. So again, I'm using my tattoo needle. I'm being very careful with the direction that the fur is going, because especially in this section, the fur makes a couple of dramatic changes in direction, where it comes out from the corner of the eye. It's a little bit harder to see now. I've got my board upside down, so I do apologise, but once I turn it back the right way, you'll be able to see. If you have a look at the reference photo as well, you can see that there's a lot of change of direction in this part of the picture. So now we're coming towards the end of the piece, and you'll start to see that I go around and I'm starting to do just a few little touch-ups in different areas. So I'll start to be hyping up the brightness that I've got, especially below and above the eye. I'm also going to go back in with a little bit of India ink, like I say, some touch-up repair ink just around the edges, just to redarken a few elements that I think may have gone a little bit too bright in places. And then the final aspect that I do is with my reference photo, I really brighten that reference photo up, and it allows me to see some of the fur that's in the dark spots, and then that way I can use those lightened areas to put into my own work really. Now, even though you can't see it on the darker picture, I feel sometimes you do need to add things that aren't necessarily there on your reference photo just to make it a little bit better, because like I say, it is just a reference photo. It's there for reference. Your piece of art is your piece of art. If you want things to be brighter, brighten them up. If you want things to be darker, darken them down. At the end of the day, it's your piece of art. No one can tell you that it's wrong. It's your interpretation. So I don't like to keep those black spots just jet black. I do like to give them a little bit of texture. So you may see me just go back in and just add a few hairs in those dark areas, just to give it a little bit more life. So like I say, we're coming to the end of this piece now. You know, I want to say thank you for if you have taken the time to sit through both videos, even this one or the first one. It really does mean a lot. If you want to see more of my work, if you want more tutorials, then let me know. You know, head over to my Facebook channel, to my Instagram page, and you'll be able to see pictures and progress pictures of what I'm working on currently. You know, I'm quite happy if you want to drop me a message. If you've got any questions about this piece or about any of my pieces, I'm quite happy to answer them. But yeah, hope you've enjoyed this, guys, and I'll see you again in the next video.